Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the Legal Defense Fund's 2024 Black History Month webinar, Athletes, Access, and the Fight for Civil Rights. This webinar is being recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate Black History Month. My name is Keisha Moore, and I am the Manager of Research at the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the Legal Defense Fund, LDF. For those who may not be familiar with LDF, LDF is America's premier legal organization fighting for racial justice. Using the power of law, narrative, research, and people, LDF defends and advances the full dignity and citizenship of Black people in America. The Thurgood Marshall Institute is the multidisciplinary center within LDF, dedicated to research, advocacy campaigns, and organizing. It also houses LDF's archives, a collection of materials chronicling the legal history of the civil rights movement. The archives team manages an archival repository of LDF's historic records, provides library services, and oversees information management. Black History Month is a time when we recognize the key roles, contributions, and sacrifices of Black Americans. It's an opportunity to spotlight and celebrate the achievements Black Americans accomplished in this country, despite the history of racism and oppression. It also serves as a call to action to all of us to bring awareness to the struggle for freedom and equal opportunity. During today's presentation, Athletes, Access, and the Fight for Civil Rights, we will talk about LDF's representation of and collaboration with athletes over its 83-year history, highlighting how Black athletes advance racial justice and spotlighting the ongoing activist efforts by contemporary athletes. For some context, in the 3+ decades after the Civil War, Black athletes often had integrated sporting opportunities. However, Jim Crow laws and prevalent segregationist sentiment still left over from the Civil War would force them from these teams. By 1900, leading Black athletes to compete in segregated leagues. Black sporting communities responded to racial exclusion by creating opportunities. At the collegiate level, historically Black colleges and universities developed an array of teams in men's and women's sports, developed their own athletic culture, and celebrated Black community traditions. As you can imagine, the process of integration was slow and often painful. Black athletes faced varying levels of racism, from taunts and Jim Crow-era travel bans to physical attacks and death threats as they attempted to compete with their white peers. Black athletes made important strides to advance racial justice by leveraging their fame and notoriety to raise awareness of the Black struggle and other underrepresented groups. In fact, Black athletes have never been able to draw a clean separation between their sports and the larger political context in which they played those sports. I'm excited to be joined today by my colleague, Ashton Wingate. Ashton Wingate is LDF's digital archivist. Ashton joined LDF in 2019. He is a core member of the team that has developed and is implementing a multi-year transformational project to digitize LDF's robust archival collection and launch an interactive, public-facing website that will enable end users to review materials, LDF archives, and alongside new editorial content. Today, Ashton will illuminate for us the contributions of Black athletes to the civil rights movement and showcase LDF's work with many of these athletes. Ashton, please share.
I'm happy to be with you today, lifting up LDF's work and sharing a bit of LDF's history in celebration of Black History Month. Our research into athletes' access and the fight for civil rights is really interesting and relevant to many of the conversations happening today around civil rights and racial justice. Looking at our records, we would often see some historic sports figures, but had never before looked at or focused our involvement on their involvement in LDF story. How LDF has supported these individuals and legendary figures as they encountered some of the same struggles in their desire to live in this country with full citizenship. I'm excited to share with you some of the things that we found. First, we'll do a little bit of an overview, just to touch on our agenda. Keisha's already done such a great job in introducing LDF and our work. Then we'll highlight some great examples of LDF's representation and collaboration with athletes. We'll then talk about the importance of equal access to public spaces and equal rights for athletes of all stripes. Finally, we'll end with how this work relates to today's challenges and opportunities. As you know, LDF has been a pioneer in racial justice since its founding. Though many of us are known for earning and protecting the civil rights for Americans, though present setting victories in the courts, an often overlooked aspect of LDF's work and our history is advocating for the rights of athletes and empowering them to use their platforms to support the fight for civil rights and racial justice on their terms. We always like to start these types of presentations with quotes from Thurgood Marshall, who is our founding president and director counsel. He is not only one of the most legendary legal figures in the civil rights movement, but he's always got something interesting to say. And of course, here he had something to say about sports during an interview with the New York Times. He states, "I gave it up when two of my teenage friends down in Baltimore threatened to sit down strike if either had to accept me on their team. I couldn't hit the side of a barn with a paddle or catch a cold in a rainstorm." The interviewer goes on to describe Thurgood Marshall as a strapping physical specimen who takes on athletic interests as a fan of professional football and baseball games, who rooted avidly for the Brooklyn and Cleveland baseball teams while picking Cleveland and the New York Yankees in football. He denies, however, that he's prejudiced as he roots very fervently for Speck Sanders, who he states is a white athlete from Texas. With that said, we'll go on and speak about our work with athletes. Here you see baseball legend Hank Aaron with NBA legend and Olympians Shaquille O'Neal and WNBA legend Lisa Leslie at the Hank Aaron Humanitarian Award Sports Dinner in 2002. First, we'll talk about our work with Jackie Robinson. We supported Mr. Robinson and provided legal advice to his family as they experienced racial prejudice buying a home in Connecticut in 1954. This speaks to the common practice at the time of racial covenants, which is a practice by which homeowners would write in specific addendums to the deed or real estate contract that would prevent the sale or lease or purchase of that property by African Americans. Roughly a decade later, Robinson and a business partner had trouble purchasing the Putnam Country Club in upstate New York, and again leaned on LDF for support. Franklin H. Williams, who spent 14 years at the Legal Defense Fund, initially serving as an assistant special counsel to Thurgood Marshall, and later on as a West Coast regional director, helped establish the Jackie Robinson Foundation in 1973. We also worked very closely with Hank Aaron and his family. They've served on our board for more than 45 years. Both have been generous supporters of LDF's work. And in honor of LDF's 80th anniversary, the Aarons made a significant donation to create the Villiers Super Aaron and Henry Aaron Endowment. In 2002, LDF celebrated the inaugural Hank Aaron Humanitarian and Sports Awards dinner. Recipients then included Senator and former NBA player Bill Bradley, former Major Leaguer Larry Doby, the first Black man to play in the American League, and legendary UCLA basketball coach John Wooden. In addition, NBA star Shaquille O'Neal was honored with the LDF Young Leaders Award that same evening. LDF honored Mr. Aaron with the Thurgood Marshall Lifetime Achievement Award. And here you see him photographed with former President Director Counsel Sherilyn Ivory. Muhammad Ali is another famous athlete that we have represented and supported. Muhammad Ali was criminally convicted for his resistance to the draft in 1967, stripped of his passport, and systematically denied a boxing license in every state. LDF went on to represent him in Muhammad Ali versus Division State Athletic Commission of New York, successfully arguing that the deprivation of a license to fight violated Ali's Fourth Amendment rights to equal protection laws. In 1971, LDF also represented Ali in Clay versus United States, an appeal of his 1967 felony conviction for refusing to report for the induction into the armed services. Justice Thurgood Marshall recused himself from the case. And here we see Ali pointing to a newspaper article showing that he's not the only one protesting the Vietnam War. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the LDF National Sports Committee. This was an effort in which we recruited athletes, Bill Russell from the Celtics, Claude Buddy Young from the New York Football Yankees, Gail Sayers from the Chicago Bears, and Bill White from the Philadelphia Phillies, to lead a team of over 20 athletes seeking $100,000 to support LDF, the equivalent of what would be nearly $1 million in today's money. This money would be used for the legal expenses incurred in the fight for civil rights and providing scholarships to deserving students. This is the first committee of its kind to gather sports figures together to address civil rights issues and recognize the influential impact of athletes to create positive social change. And here we see the athletes pictured with our second President Director Counsel, Jack Greenberg, at the LDF National Sports Awards Committee luncheon in 1967. Just a bit more about the National Sports Committee. These are artifacts from our archives, and you can see the press release here, written and authored by the athletes that have signed below, stating the intention of the sports committee and what their goals were. You can also see a quote from Claude Young that really expresses now what is sort of a commonplace tone and sentiment that you hear from a lot of athletes. He goes on to say, you can't put the athlete in a tiny microcosm anymore because he simply can't stay there and live with his conscience. His life doesn't end when he leaves leaves the court or the ballpark. He's a citizen with kids in a school system somewhere and taxes to pay the same as everyone else. It's a new breed of baseball player. He's going to get involved in his community. Moving on to more contemporary examples, you see here the case of Robbie Tolan versus Cotton in 2014. Robbie Tolan was shot by a police officer in the driveway of his parents' home after being mistakenly suspected of driving a stolen car. The wounds from the shot ended his baseball career. The Supreme Court announced that the excessive force lawsuit filed by the Washington Nationals baseball player was improperly dismissed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. In reaching this conclusion, the Supreme Court agreed with the arguments presented by LDF in the amicus brief it filed in support of Mr. Tolan's appeal. The case returned to the lower courts for an evaluation of the police officer's entitlement to qualified immunity based on proper review of all the relevant evidence. The case would be eventually settled out of court for monetary sum. Recently, LDF worked with LeBron James and the More Than a Vote campaign to launch We Got Next, an ad campaign in November of 2020. We Got Next combined the cultural influence of the More Than a Vote athletes and artists with LDF's resources and longstanding voting rights expertise and community engagement in a nonpartisan effort to recruit young activists to work at polling locations in vulnerable Black communities across the nation. With LeBron's help, LDF was able to deploy over 1,300 poll monitors and recruit 42,500 poll workers. Without these poll workers, access to the ballot box itself would have been threatened, not only by increased wait times and longer lines, but also by the possibility that polling locations would be shuttered due to the lack of election staff able to run them. I want to also talk a little bit about equal access and equal rights and the importance of ensuring that amateur athletes, professional athletes, and everyday people can equally enjoy and participate in sports and athletics. Here you see another artifact from our archives, the case Draper versus the City of St. Louis, which is a case that involves access to public swimming pools. Access to places like public swimming pools and other public areas is really important. And you can imagine the type of impact that it has had over time in terms of Black people's ability to participate in athletics and work and practice their athletic skill. The love of sports begins as a child for many people. That opportunity was taken away historically through segregated spaces where Blacks were not allowed to experience, learn, or participate in organized sports. Places like public pools, public parks, golf courses, country clubs, gymnasiums, indoor and outdoor sporting fields, anywhere that you can imagine somebody might want to play sports. Jim Crow laws at the time prevented Black people from having those types of opportunities in many instances. Title IX is another really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to issues related to discrimination in athletics. It requires civil rights protections for all students, regardless of race, sex, or gender identity. The legislation was passed in 1972, but requires constant enforcement and is something LDF is still very involved with today. Things like equal pay, equal facilities and resources, LGBTQIA+ rights, and full participation in educational programs and school activities are central to the fight to support and enforce Title IX legislation. Finally, the Crown Act is something that we've worked on most recently. Black people are often forced to face consequences at school for their natural hairstyles and invest time to mold themselves to adhere to Eurocentric standards in terms of the way they should or are viewed to have should wear their hair. Examples you can see below from Nicole Piles to Andrew Johnson of individuals who were forced to either cut their hair or bow out of competition due to their not adhering to whatever the established rules at their school or for sporting events were at the time. LDF continues to support these young athletes in their pursuit of athletics while being their full and authentic selves during that process. Finally, we'll talk a little bit more about how this work relates to today's challenges and opportunities. And here you see NCAA champion, NBA legend, and Olympian Carmelo Anthony presenting the 2023 National Equal Justice Award to honorees Nike, Jordan Brand, and Converse, who have supported LDF in our work with voting rights and police reform. We're thankful for these opportunities to work in partnership with legendary sports figures like Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and the other ones that you've seen here in this presentation, as well as brands like Nike to raise support and awareness that are needed to carry out LDF's mission and address emerging civil rights crises as they persist and change. Here you see a photo of protesters holding up a picture of George Floyd. Support from the Michael Jordan Family Foundation helped us at LDF significantly ramp up our police reforming initiative and now has changed or evolved into a permanent program, Justice and Public Safety. LDF continues to educate voters and fight for everyone to have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process. Recently, we advocated for fair political representation at the state level in Allen versus Milligan, combating gerrymandered districts, redistricting maps in Alabama that disenfranchise Black voters. Similarly, just last week, Louisiana's state legislature passed a congressional map adding secondary majority district, Black district, in Robinson versus Landry. This is a historic win not only for LDF's continued fight for racial justice and preparation for this election year, but also for Black Louisianians, for the Voting Rights Act, and for our democracy. I want to thank everyone here for taking a little bit of time to help us celebrate Black History Month, to learn a little bit more about LDF's history in this area. And I encourage you to continue diving into this, learning a little bit more about it. And if you'd like to know more about not only this, but everything happening at LDF and all of the important issues that we're working on, we ask that you please follow us on our social media channels that are below and being shared in the chat.
I would like to thank Ashton for sharing his insight on the lasting contributions of Black athletes to the advancement of racial justice. Thank you, Ashton. I would also like to thank everyone in our audience for taking the time to learn about these often untold stories of Black athletes. LDF's work would not be possible without the continued support of our generous individuals, corporations, and foundations, which enable our ongoing work to defend the full dignity, humanity, and citizenship of Black people in America. Thank you for your time and for your support.